Right. Well, what they did in June of 50, President Truman extended everybody that was on active duty for convenience of the government, it was called, supposedly 1 year until nobody knew if this war was going to end tomorrow or years or how. So you were everyone on active duty, regardless how much time you had to do, was extended convenience of the government. They called it under that heading. So being I got extended, I was never in combat. None of the six of us. So we says, look, we're probably not going to come back. If you go, let's get the $360 at least. We could have a few beers before we go over to the island. Well, we didn't know nothing about the country. The government didn't have too many brochures on it. Korea, I don't think, was Hawaii, the Far East, although it was called the Belgium of the Far East. Why? Because it was an in-between island between Japan and China and Russia. And any kind of war or conflict going on, they would use Korea as the land, like they used Belgium in World War I and World War II, the deciding factor between the Germans, the French, the Americans, and the British. It was called the Belgium of the Far East. But they're a peaceful country as a rule, the people. But they were dominated by the Japanese for 36, 38 years prior to us releasing them back to their own independence in 1950, when we stopped the flow of communism. So we were all, gung-ho to go, so to speak, John Wayne. But we were lucky because when a lot of the reservists were activated, like my platoon sergeant, they were World War II vets. They already had a taste of combat. They've been shot at. They've been wounded. So 2 weeks at 10 Camp 2 in California while we regrouped out there to go to Korea before the landing, at least, they would tell you what to anticipate because they fought the Japanese, and there was no cream puff. But you still can't visualize it if you've never been there.
The Korean War began on 25 June 1950, a Sunday morning, when North Korea's communist dictator, Kim Il-sung, sent his Soviet-equipped army crashing across the border into South Korea. Greatly outnumbered and poorly equipped, with no tanks or air support and little artillery, the four understrength Republic of Korea divisions, deployed along the line separating the two Koreas, were ground under and swept aside. Rushed hurriedly from occupation duty in Japan, U.S. Army units, equally under strength, fared no better. By late August, friendly forces had been compressed into a small perimeter around the vital port city of Pusan on the southernmost tip of the Korean peninsula. The North Koreans were throwing everything they had at the small brigade of Marines blocking the most direct approach to the city. Were Pusan to fall, all of Korea would become a communist state, a dagger aimed directly at Japan and a mortal threat to American interests in Northern Asia. With all attention focused on the fight for Pusan and the outcome of the war hanging in the balance, one American was thinking of something else. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander in the theater, saw more of an opportunity than a threat. He would launch an attack of his own. The North Korean forces hammering at the vital ring around Busan were at the end of a long supply line, confined to the meager Korean road network. That supply line would be severed by an amphibious landing force sent ashore at the port of Inchon on Korea's west coast. At the same time, friendly forces would break out of their defensive positions around Busan and strike northward. Caught between both forces, the North Korean invaders would be smashed. The plan hinged on three considerations. Two were highly promising, while the third held disturbing elements. The plan was operationally brilliant and audacious, a masterstroke that would destroy the North Korean invasion force. Thanks to a highly secret intelligence operation, MacArthur's concept for a landing at Inchon would find the landing force opposed by only a feeble handful of North Korean units once ashore. Hydrographically, though, Inchon was an amphibious task force commander's nightmare that could threaten the entire operation. The sole approach to the objective area itself was by way of a narrow, winding channel, a natural bottleneck. A single ship sunk in that channel would bring the entire operation to a crashing halt. Any elements of the task force below that obstacle would have no choice other than to withdraw. Ships above the blockage would be trapped, little more than large floating targets. An equally daunting obstacle was Inchon's infamous tidal range. The difference between high tide and low tide could be as much as 35 feet. An inner harbor that could support LSTs at high tide could shrink to a narrow dredged channel a scant 13 feet deep. What was deep water at high tide became a swampy mudflat that couldn't float a rowboat at low tide. Vehicles attempting to cross that mudflat would sink out of sight. Complicating the situation even more was the small island of Wolmi-do, which was connected to the mainland by a causeway. Enemy forces on Wolmi-do could pour flanking fire into the landing waves long before they reached the beach, which wasn't really a beach at all. Rather than land on a sandy beach, the assault waves would touch down directly into a populated city. One landing beach, designated Red Beach, actually terminated abruptly at a high seawall. Marines would have to debark from their landing craft on scaling ladders to find themselves in the middle of downtown Inchon. MacArthur revealed his plan during a meeting at Pearl Harbor on the eve of our nation's 174th anniversary in July. Later, he made it known that he further intended to have a full division ashore at Inchon before the close of business on Friday, 15 September, less than 2.5 months away. Major General Oliver P. Smith's 1st Marine Division was anything but full. A year earlier, Army General Omar N. Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, predicted that large-scale amphibious operations will never occur again. The American taxpayers, weary of war in general, wanted to believe him, and their representatives, including President Harry S. Truman, had shrunk the military in general and the Marine Corps in particular. From its peak of 485,000 warriors on 31 August 1945, the Marine Corps was stripped to 156,000 by 1 July 1946. By June 1950, when 90,000 men of the North Korean People's Army overran the 38th parallel, the whole Marine Corps, mustering everyone from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, totaled less than 75,000. There was, however, a pool of experienced combat veterans from World War II, scattered in 138 separate units throughout 126 cities nationwide. They were the Marine Corps Reserve, who numbered 90,000, and it was from these Minutemen of the 1950s that General Smith would flesh out the ranks of his division. The Joint Chiefs told MacArthur that there was no way a division would be ready before November or December. The Marines didn't believe them, and apparently neither did President Truman when he obtained authorization from Congress to mobilize the entire organized Marine Corps Reserve and extend current contracts of those in the regular forces. The reserves came quickly, albeit reluctantly in many cases. These were men who had only recently gotten over the nightmare of World War II and were now pursuing their individual versions of the American dream. The Corps quickly and efficiently screened numerous requests for waivers from active duty, disapproving most. They also short-stopped about 500 Marines who had yet to see their 18th birthday. The rest funneled into Camp Pendleton, California, where they became reacquainted with the equipment of war. Their battle dress was of a different age, consisting of steel pot helmets with tattered camouflage covers and herringbone utilities, faded blue-gray with a black Eagle Globe and anchor over the USMC stenciled on the left breast pocket. Yet it wasn't any of this by which the communists would come to know them. Although Army units had been equipped with combat boots for almost a decade, Marines sailing for Korea still laced canvas leggings over boondockers. These obsolete leggings became badges of courage by which the enemy differentiated between soldier and leatherneck. They were terrified of the yellow legs. In an outfit where marksmanship is everything, the standard issue weapon to the infantryman or crunchy was the M1 Garand rifle. Encased in a linseed-oiled walnut or birch stock, this 43.6-inch 9.5-pound bullet launcher took an 8-round clip and could easily decimate enemy ranks at 500 or more yards away. Smaller, lighter, and faster, but with less range, stopping power, and accuracy, the M1 carbine was issued to officers and section leaders. But it was the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, model 1918A2, around which 4-man fire teams were built. The BAR was awesome in its day, and the man who handled it commanded respect. Usually an expert, the automatic rifleman fired his BAR, which, fully loaded with a 20-round magazine and bipod, dressed out at 19.4 pounds. For all of its heft, it was a weapon that could fire the standard M2 ball cartridge singly, in bursts of 3, or fully automatic into a Nat's running lights at more than twice the 500 yards of effective range stated in the manuals. In the hands of professionals, these high-powered, all-weather weapons could wreak deadly destruction, and the men who handled them were professionals, veterans of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and countless other killing fields of the Pacific. Sprinkled like salt among them were legends of the Corps who went back to the Banana Wars and earlier, augmented by 2,700 members of the Republic of Korea 1st Marine Regiment and 2,700 U.S. Army soldiers. The 1st Marine Division became a melting pot of 25,400 men. Colonel Lewis B. Chesty Puller commanded the 1st Marine Regiment. While made up of veterans, they would not work together as a unit until they hit Blue Beach on Inchon's southern flank with the Republic of Korea 1st Marine Regiment. To the north, Red Beach would belong to 2 battalions of Lieutenant Colonel Ray Murray's 5th Marines. 3rd Battalion assaulted Green Beach on the island of Wolmi-do, who had been part of the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade shoring up the Pusan Perimeter and inflicting 9,900 casualties on the North Koreans in 34 days. They had pulled off the lines on the night of September 5th, backloading on the 13th, and sailed through the Tsushima Strait to join other ships of the fleet sailing from the Japanese port of Kobe, where the division docked after leaving California in mid-August. They caught the fringes of Typhoon Kezin, which spread misery in the troop compartments, but provided cloud cover for their rendezvous on 15 September off the Korean west coast. The way to Seoul was through the yellow seaport of Inchon, 20 miles to the west and famous for its extreme tidal ranges, second to none in the world. MacArthur had chosen 15 September as D-Day because the tidal range on Inchon would reach a high water mark of 31.2 feet, allowing ships and landing craft the best opportunity to navigate through flying fish and east channels and over mud flats which ran for miles when the tide waned. As it was, the amphibious vehicles of the Army and Marines would still not float high enough to drop their ramps. Marines would have to use ladders and grappling hooks to scale the 16-foot walls that diked the city. Aerial reconnaissance photos showed the North Koreans working on a network of formidable fortifications. How far along they'd progressed or what resistance was in place were unknown variables of war. Nobody expected a cakewalk, but they were also hoping it wouldn't be another Tarawa.
You were anxious to go.
We were anxious to go. Everything was all ready to roll. Everybody really anticipated victory naturally, and not knowing, what lied ahead, but they just wanted to go. First off, you get disgusted aboard ship anyway, and you want to go on land, and not only that, as you're riding around, you just don't come off the nets and go into the ship and then go right into the beach. You got to get into that LCVP, and then you get into a pattern until the rest of the ship is unloaded. So you're out there circling for 45 minutes, sometimes an hour. And mind you, you got a jacket on, it stinks, a cakewalk jacket, it's supposed to be your lifesaver. We had no vest, bulletproof vest then in the 50s. And your equipment, you're loaded for bear because you don't know how long it'll be before they bring you any, rations or anything else, ammunition. So you're really loaded, and you're riding around in the choppy seas there, waiting until everybody's unloaded, and then they give the word, hit the beach, and then they peel off and start making it for the beach. And at Inchon, because of the seawall, we had ladders. It wasn't a landing like in some of the World War II landings where it was a sandy beach, naturally with the enemy shooting. So we didn't get too much light. When we were coming in close, we had a couple of rounds, then you knew it was for real. But we were lucky. We didn't lose nobody coming in.
Now, this is your actual first taste of combat.
Yes.
Can you sort of tell us a little bit how you felt personally about this? In other words, what were your feelings about it?
I felt good. I was just saying, hopefully that they tell you in training that the round that goes off you don't hear is the one that gets you. So you're anticipating that, but you're definitely, wide awake naturally, and you're just looking for the enemy.
And that feeling was shared among your fellow.
I would venture to say the whole group, sure.
They were up for this.
Everybody was up.
Reveille was played over the ship's loudspeaker systems at 3 a.m. Most Marines were already wide awake. For some, breakfast consisted of powdered eggs, toast with no butter, and canned apricots. Most were too nervous to eat. The first streaks of dawn broke pink over the massed armada that was Joint Task Force 7. That's when the shooting started. The serene Asian calm exploded in an apocalyptic barrage of rockets, bombs, and napalm, heralding the first major amphibious assault by Americans since Okinawa on 1 April 1945. This was the assault of Wolmi-do. Inchon would come that afternoon. Private First Class Doug Koch and other members of D Company 5th Marines watched from USS Cavalier. Everybody felt this was going to be the indicator. If Wolmi-do fell easily, it probably meant we would not have too tough a go on Red Beach. About 10 o'clock, the ship announced resistance was moderate and, best of all, losses were light. This news was greeted by a very loud cheer.
The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had the initial assault during the Inchon landing, and that was my photo assignment. They were to capture the strongly manned, heavily fortified island of Wolmi-do in Inchon Harbor and hold it at all costs throughout the day. It was a tricky mission, for the extreme tides meant that the Marines, once ashore, could not be reinforced until the next high tide that evening, when the full-scale invasion of the mainland would occur. At dawn on September 15, 1950, following a heavy sea and air bombardment, the Marines struck the island and quickly had the situation well in hand. The now combat-hardened Yellowlegs stormed the defenders, devastating them on hillsides and routing them from bunkers with such elan and efficiency that General Douglas MacArthur, watching from his flagship, hailed the landing as one of the Corps' finest hours. As for my secondary military occupational specialty, now called photojournalism, I practiced the lessons from our days in the Pusan Perimeter. Surprisingly, war is difficult to photograph, not because of the peril, but because even the deadliest of firefights could look tame on film as peacetime maneuvers. The key to capturing warfare, I had learned, was to freeze in time those moments that graphically declared that this was war, without question, from infantry passing burning buildings to taking prisoners. Time and tide wait for no man, it said, so the Marines on Wolmi-do could only wait for both. Guarding a long causeway that spanned the harbor to Inchon proper, they settled down to day-long vigilance until the greatest show on earth that evening. The pre-invasion bombardment of the mainland was so spectacular that we kidded that we could make fortunes if we could peddle grandstand seats for the fireworks. But the banter died, and lumps of raw emotion caught in our throats as we watched the first waves of our fellow Marines head so vulnerably and bravely toward the seawalls and beaches. The sight of other Marines at risk evokes unforgettable, incredibly powerful feelings of unabashed pride and concern, and yes, prayer. Quite simply, it's brotherhood, as blood binding as family. Napoleon had a word for it. I may lose battles, he once remarked, but I do not lose minutes. This might well have been the motto of the Marine Engineers and Shore Party at Inchon, for there were no minutes to spare when the 1st Marine Division hit the beaches on 15 September 1950 as the landing force of 10 Corps. The planners had deemed it necessary to take several calculated risks, and they put it up to the Engineers and Shore Party to win a critical race against time and tide in the rain-swept darkness of D-Day. The 1st Engineer Battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John H. Partridge, and the 1st Shore Party Battalion by Lieutenant Colonel Henry P. Crow. Each unit had been represented by a company in the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, so that neither battalions was complete until the remaining elements arrived for the Inchon landing. A good deal of field experience had been acquired by the men who served in the brigade, and the others had received shipboard instruction as well as some practical training at Kobe. Progress might have been most costly, however, if a squad of engineers had not been on hand to remove some 300 Russian anti-personnel bombs. The shore party was represented by a team that unloaded LSTs, assisted by the engineers as more of their units landed. Offshore mudflats prevented the solid breaching of these craft, so that corduroy roads had to be hastily built onto the ramps. Enemy small arms fire interfered at times, but the engineers took a few prisoners without incurring any casualties of their own. During the next several hours, the engineers and shore party elements swarmed over the battered island, transforming it into an advanced base for the assault on Inchon. The 1,000-foot concrete causeway leading from Wolmi-do to the mainland was scanned for mines, then repaired so that marine tanks could cross. A good day's work had already been accomplished before 1730, when the landing boats churned the water as naval gunfire and rockets made the Inchon target area heave with explosions.
The bombing and airstrikes on Inchon and Wolmi-do continued all day. The drone of propellers from carrier-based Vought F-4U Corsairs of Marine Fighter Squadron 323, Death Rattlers, and VMF 214 Black Sheep signaled support from the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. Sorties flown by these squadrons and the Navy, coupled with 2,845 shells of naval gunfire from warships, so dangerously close to running aground their crews were prepared to repel boarders, caused the entire beach area of Inchon to disappear in an enormous cloud of dust and smoke, with only the occasional glare of a rocket burst, said Second Lieutenant Frank Moitzel of A Company in USS Henrico. It was awesome. It was heady stuff, to be sure, that got Moitzel's antenna quivering, a feeling not uncommon when live ammunition is used and rounds go down range. PFC Koch nervously checked his equipment several times over and went over the side, down cargo nets to the landing craft bouncing in the waves. At 5:39 p.m., waves of assault vehicles came abreast and churned toward Inchon, disappearing in clouds of ugly smoke that hid the city. Red Beach was getting closer, said Koch. It made me feel very small and insignificant. The noise got louder, and we began to take small arms fire. Vehicles hit the seawall, dropped their ramps as far as possible, and scaling ladders were thrown into place. Marines flung a barrage of grenades over the wall. At the first sound of explosions, they started up the ladders. Second Lieutenant Tom Gibson of Mortar Company told a fellow Marine, First Lieutenant Baldomero Lopez, a graduate of the Naval Academy and a World War II veteran, there is this famous photograph of Marines landing on Red Beach. It shows a lot of Marines waiting to climb over the seawall. One Marine, however, is already on a ladder, his right leg on the seawall. That Marine was Punchy Lopez.
For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as a rifle platoon commander of Company A, 1st Battalion 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division Reinforced, in action against enemy aggressor forces during the Inchon invasion in Korea on 15 September 1950. With his platoon, 1st Lieutenant Lopez was engaged in the reduction of immediate beach defenses after landing with the assault waves. Exposing himself to hostile fire, he moved forward along inside a bunker and prepared to throw a hand grenade into the next pillbox whose fire was pinning down that sector of the beach. Taken under fire by an enemy automatic weapon and hit in the right shoulder and chest as he lifted his arm to throw, he fell backward and dropped the deadly missile. After a moment, he turned and dragged his body forward in an effort to retrieve the grenade and throw it. In critical condition from pain and loss of blood, and unable to grasp the hand grenade firmly enough to hurl it, he chose to sacrifice himself rather than endanger the lives of his men, and with a sweeping motion of his wounded right arm, cradled the grenade under him and absorbed the full impact of the explosion. His exceptional courage, fortitude, and devotion to duty reflect the highest credit upon First Lieutenant Lopez and the United States Naval Service. He gallantly gave his life for his country.
There was no time to waste. It was getting dark and the tide was ebbing. Amid heavy small arms and mortar fire, Marines jumped on the ladders so forcefully that many snapped under their weight, but they poured over the top of the seawall. Sergeant Charles Allen of A Company scaled the wall under heavy fire from his flank and front. Several Marines were cut down right behind him. Moitzel's platoon broke through a gap in the seawall, jumped into a trench, and threw grenades at a pillbox, causing 6 bloody North Koreans to surrender. 8 Marines died in the first 10 minutes of the assault. However, the rest continued to push their way into Inchon's high ground called Cemetery Hill and seized the British consulate while moving on towards Observatory Hill. At Blue Beach, nearly 3 miles southeast, Able, Dog, Charlie, and Baker companies of the 1st Marines attempted to flank the North Korean garrison and cut off any possible retreat. It had begun to rain, and in the fading light there was great and deadly confusion. Landing ship tanks, moving toward the beach to discharge their cargo, opened up with 20 and 40 millimeter guns, spraying Marine units on the advance. Demolitions set by shore party members to clear holes in the seawall blew in the midst of the Marines. The Navy fired 6,000 rockets in 20 minutes into the city. The barrage totally demolished the Asahi Brewery, much to the chagrin of Marines who'd been promised a beer bust to end all beer busts if the brewery was taken intact. Not a bottle was left unbroken. Many would never forgive the Navy for this atrocity. The naval and air support, however, took its toll on members of the North Korean People's Army's 226th Regiment, who started surrendering in numbers. Marines with flamethrowers and 3.5-inch rocket launchers flushed the rest. It had a price. By day's end, 20 Marines had been killed and 187 wounded. Enemy casualties for 2 days would total 300 killed in action and 1,350 wounded. In 8 hours, 13,000 Marines and all their equipment were ashore. MacArthur had been at his tactical best.
Well, that was our first taste of the city, because a lot of it were grass mud huts, thatched huts that were put together where the farming people who worked at the rice paddies lived. Coming into Seoul now, you're looking at a city, not the way it is today, but they still had some concrete buildings there. And our objective was the train station, which is still up today. And the interior was all mosaic top, beautiful concrete edifice. But we did the train station, and then in the train, surrounding the train station was the town somewhat. And being it was the capital of South Korea, it was pretty congested. So that was my first taste, our first taste of street fighting in the city. And every important intersection like had sandbagging placements from the South Koreans who tried to defend it, and then the North Koreans came and took over. So a lot of them were halfway destroyed, some were still intact. But it was a different symbol because you moved from home to home. It wasn't like our homes, but, building to building, put it that way. And then you didn't know where the sniper could be hiding. So that was a different omen.
Totally different type of warfare. And you were trained for that.
Yes.
As far as the Marine training.
And you weren't out in the open field like normally you would be, out in where most of the fighting occurred. Now you're inside it, like the GIs happened to have in Europe in World War II. It's street fighting. That's a different omen. You really have to watch your step there.
The 8th Army at Pusan had launched a counterattack out of the perimeter, and the Marines had stabbed into Inchon, astonishing the North Koreans. Leaving Inchon to the ROK Marines, the 1st Marine Division was to strike out towards Seoul and thrust beyond until the back of the North Korean People's Army snapped. The road to Seoul started out easily enough. Captain Sam Jaskilka led E Company, 5th Marines, to link up with 1st Marines, thereby sealing off Inchon. Elements of the 5th Marines, including Koch's company, prepared to peel off to the northeast toward Gimpo Airfield. Too late, the enemy realized it was spread too thin. In a desperate attempt to slow the Marine advance, it sent Russian T-34 Caviar Can tanks, but they didn't account for the Marine air support.
D+1 found the pilots of both Marine squadrons flying interdiction missions, attacking targets of opportunity as far as Seoul and Suwon. Altogether, they flew 72 sorties. The juiciest prize of the day fell to VMF 214 when the 0545 flight located 6 enemy T-34 tanks approaching the outskirts of Inchon. The 8 Marines attacked, dropping 6 500-pound bombs and 2 napalm tanks. One enemy tank was destroyed by a direct napalm hit, another had its tread blown off, and a third developed a fuel leak. After the first flight had expended all its armament, a second 8-plane flight took up the attack. The relieving pilots found 2 of the tanks parked together. These they hit with napalm, burning both. Of the 4 remaining tanks, all were damaged. Destruction of the tanks was not without its price. Captain William F. Simpson was killed when his plane crashed and exploded after taking hits on a strafing run.
PFC Koch and forward elements of his company were awakened by the clanking of tank treads. "I knew it was too late to run," Koch said. He and the rest pulled ponchos over their heads and lay still while 6 tanks and 250 communist infantry moved by and then out of sight around the bend, where they ran into First Lieutenant H.J. Smith's dog company. It turned into a turkey shoot. 2.36 and 3.5-inch bazooka rocket launchers back to the 75mm recoilless rifles that were brought to bear, led by Corporal Okie Douglas, who closed to within 75 yards before firing his first rocket into the lead tank. He went on to help destroy a second, while other Marines opened up with rifles, machine guns, and BARs, killing 200 enemy in a matter of seconds. About the same time, on the outskirts of Sosari, PFC Walter Monaghan of 1st Marines took on 6 tanks with his 3.5-inch launcher. He waited until the lead tank was within 50 yards before firing. When it blew, the hatch opened. Monaghan grabbed his carbine and killed an escaping crewman. Monaghan's assistant gunner reloaded the launcher. Monaghan fired a second rocket, stopping the second tank. This gave the rest of his unit time to sight in on the remaining armor, eventually destroying all 6 T-34s. Timing is everything. Right afterward, General MacArthur arrived on an inspection tour. Seeing the hulks of destroyed enemy armor, he remarked, "You damn Marines always manage to stage everything to your advantage, even a visit by the General." Koch, watching it all from a hill while eating his sea rations, didn't know whether to throw the General a salute or what. However, he did notice, after the General left, a kid from a village jabbering to one of the interpreters. The interpreter went over to a lieutenant. The 2 of them climbed down the hill to the road where General MacArthur had stood, and the interpreter hollered into a culvert. A moment later, 7 armed North Koreans came out, their hands on their heads. They had been there since the battle ended. MacArthur may have been lucky. However, luck ran out for Frank Moitzel the next morning. A Russian machine gun tore off the calf of my right leg and then hit and killed Corporal Tom Callison. Second Lieutenant Moitzel, who had asked Headquarters Marine Corps for orders to Korea, lost his right leg.
Only light resistance awaited the rest of the way to the airfield, which was secured late that afternoon. While other units of the tank battalions were attached to the 5th Marines, Company B accompanied the 1st Marines on a parallel route towards Yong Dongpo, an industrial suburb of Seoul. And these untried tankmen came through a baptism of fire on D+2 that would have tested veterans. The infantry of George Company was mounted on the tanks to spearhead the regimental advance along the main Inchon-Seoul highway. Enemy automatic and small arms fire stopped the column repeatedly, compelling the riflemen to dismount and deploy on both sides for a combined tank and infantry assault. 5 attacks of this sort had to be launched, with the guns of the tanks supplying the only available supporting fires of the final 3-hour battle. It was a rugged assignment for tankmen, who refueled from the pump of an Amtrak, though enemy fire made the crews take to cover several times. But Company B gave a good account of itself, destroying the only enemy tank encountered that day, as well as several anti-tank guns and machine gun emplacements. The tanks resumed the attack along the infantry at dawn and advanced for 8 hours, destroying an AT gun, an artillery piece, and an unknown number of infantry. Company B was relieved late that afternoon by Company C, which was alerted to prepare for a large-scale enemy tank attack in the morning. This effort did not materialize, and the new tankmen were held up in their advance by the most extensive minefield encountered so far by Marines in Korea. After the lead tank was disabled by an explosion, the other machines fired in support of the infantry as engineers cleared the road.
While there were particularly bitter pockets of resistance, the way to Kimpo and Seoul was relatively open. 5 days after landing, Kimpo, its airfield, and Russian fighter aircraft belonged to the 5th Marines, with Captain Jaskilka's Easy Company leading the way. On the morning of 20 September, the 1st Marine Division hit the banks of the Han River and the outskirts of Yong Dongpo. Yong Dongpo is to Seoul what New Jersey is to New York, a large industrial suburb. Communist leaders realized that if Yong Dongpo was lost, Seoul would fall. They sent a regiment across the Han River to counterattack Puller's 1st Marines in the early morning darkness. The enemy came with mortar fire and T-34 tanks. PFC Monaghan and 2 others ran to meet the attack with their rocket launchers. Monaghan missed the first tank as the column of 4 closed to less than 100 yards. He put a round directly into the 3rd one. Reloaded, he scored a direct hit on another as small arms fire from both sides hosed the area. Marine mortars and anti-tank weapons entered the battle, said Staff Sergeant Lee Berge of E Company. Enemy infantrymen sought shelter. The bazooka teams closed in for the kill. I saw one Marine, Monaghan, step into the open fire. The man was hit instantly by a machine gun burst. His round, however, found its mark. The enemy made an assault to break out of the firefight. Lieutenant Howard Four responded, telling his Marines, "Okay, you leathernecks, fix bayonets and start sticking the bastards." In bloody hand-to-hand fighting, the Marines killed more than 300 of the enemy. In the process, PFC Monaghan died from his wounds. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The battle for Yong Dongpo turned into a fight of supporting arms. Artillery, airstrikes, and rockets blanketed every suspected concentration of enemy troops. One battalion of the 11th Marine Regiment, which had recently joined the division, expended 1,656 howitzer rounds in duels with North Korean mortars, tanks, and field pieces. However, it was still the individual infantrymen who made the difference. Captain Robert Barrow's A Company, 1st Marines, pried their way into the city. That night, his unit stumbled onto North Koreans who were massing for an assault. So close he could hear an officer haranguing his troops for the assault, Corporal Billy Webb crawled into position so he could see around the building separating the 2 forces. He then sighted in on the officer, whom he could see standing on a small rostrum, and dropped him with 1 round. Hearing the shot, Barrow yelled, "What the hell happened?" Webb yelled back, "Captain, that poor bastard just talked himself to death." Death stalked PFC Doug Koch, who'd just been made squad leader and was leading his men up a hill. All of a sudden, I felt like I got kicked in the hip by a horse. Initially feeling no pain, he waved off his platoon as they moved out to engage the enemy. It turned out to be a big mistake. Alone, in the open, he treated his wound when he was shot again. Another slug went through his jacket. He looked up and a round hit the dirt in front of his nose. Help was not able to get to him until several hours later when the enemy was driven off. A shot of morphine eased his pain. When he awoke, he was on a stretcher out of battle and eventually was home. He never saw who shot him. Yong Dongpo was leveled. Seoul was next. The name Seoul is a Korean word meaning capital. Established 100 years before Columbus ever saw the New World, it was the seat of the Yi dynasty, which ruled until 1910. By 1950, it numbered 2 million people, some of whom were recent interlopers of the North Korean People's Army.
When the paragraphs on Korea are inserted in that large volume listing the Corps' achievements, they will stand equally with older illustrious stories of deeds and battles. They were written by the present-day Marine in the same kind of bravery, unfailing discipline, courage, and loyalty to his comrades. What did this Marine look like? What did he think as he trudged the scarlet miles to Seoul and history? He was a caricature if you judged him by the slick-looking Marines who went through the gates of Camp Pendleton last June. His dungarees were dusty and grimy. He was sweaty and bearded. The slight swagger he had in the States was traded for a lithe, wary stride. In every sense, he was trimmed down in body weight, equipment, and weapons to the ideal fighting machine. Every piece of his gear had a purpose. The lethal fripperies like fancy pistols, ugly trench knives, and crisscross cartridge bandoliers were left for the use of the deadly fighters in the rear echelons. His humor was honed to a grim edge, and he didn't laugh quite as much as he did in June. He was older and wiser. He had a tolerant disdain for the men in the rear areas with their tools and typewriters. After all, weren't they the peons in this war, working to keep him in power? He was the temporary monarch of the explosive ground he took, and his scepter was an M1. Plus his faith in God, he had another abiding trust, his faith in his fire team. He placed strong reliance on the abilities of the men in the squad and platoon. The platoon had 3 other like units that made up the company, but none of the other 3 platoons were able to fight quite as well as his platoon. In the military scheme of things, he knew there were 2 other companies that made up his battalion, but they didn't get in as much combat or kill as many Reds as his company. There was no point in going further. The 2 other battalions that made up the regiment were somewhat useful allies in the personal war he and his fire team were waging against the North Korean aggressors. What he saw and experienced is what he believed, the rest was scuttlebutt. To be sure, he had a limited perspective, but he saw the war in a limited manner, and he saw more of it, in a way, than all the colonels and generals back in their command posts.
The 1st Marine Division was ordered by the Army Commander, 10th Corps, to make a frontal assault on the city. The order came while General Smith's Marines were under counterattack in several areas, one of the bloodiest fights being waged north of the city. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, had run into a hornet's nest on the morning of 24 September. Dog Company took the brunt of it. In a day-long slaughter of epic proportions, D Company suffered 36 killed, including its commander, Lieutenant H.J. Smith, 116 medically evacuated, and 26 walking wounded. Only a handful of the 206 Marines who had entered the fray remained. The battalion, however, counted more than 1,500 enemy dead by nightfall. At dawn, the Marines would counter. Joined after Inchon by Colonel Homer L. Litzenberg's 7th Marines, 3 Marine infantry regiments would pour into Seoul during 2 days of bloody fighting. Again, it was the individual Marine, backed by tanks, who did the dirty work. It seemed that every building in Seoul housed an enemy sniper, said Staff Sergeant Pergy. We cleaned out doorways and rooftops. We went from street to street, house to house. We knocked holes in walls and tossed grenades through the openings.
The enemy was making it rough on Dog Company. They were fighting a nasty house-to-house, barricade-to-barricade defense of the town. In actions of this type, there could be no flanking of a position. Only so many men can get into the fight. The width of the street, available cover, and strength of the enemy fire dictate the number of troops that can be brought to bear on any one position. There's a large turnover of troops in the point, but a clever street fighter who doesn't take outlandish chances can get through a day of fighting and age only a decade or 2. Each barricade is a separate battle all by itself. Once the wall is busted, the enemy doesn't take off in full retreat. He moves back to the next barricade, and the fighting is as furious for that position as it was for the previous one. The North Koreans had enough time to get properly set up for their defense, while the 1st and 5th Marines were fighting their way from Inchon. They did their work well. At intervals from 400 to 600 yards, they constructed their barricades. They were substantial works built of woven fiber sandbags around 5 or 6 feet at the base and rising to a height of 5 feet, extending from one side of the street to the other. Anti-tank and machine guns studded the walls, and anti-tank mines were sown in the streets in front of these fortifications. The enemy commander must have figured the Marines were bound to stumble running nightmarish hurdles like these, and they'd be easy targets for his defending forces to mop up when they did. Of course, it didn't quite work out that way. 2 tanks had edged to the corner, and 4 more came up behind. As we moved forward, one tank cautiously nosed round the bend. He opened up immediately, and so did the point fire team, moving along the left side of the street. It wasn't all give and no take. The North Koreans were poking stuff back at the Marines. While the tank was cutting at the barricade with his 90mm and machine guns, and a BAR man was working through his second clip, the enemy was punching back with an anti-tank gun. We could see the red tracer shells rip through the buildings on the left, narrowly missing the tank and burning themselves out in a clear space beyond. Captain Welby Kronk, Dog Company commander, had moved to the corner. He watched the action for a minute, then moved back. The best way to clear the barricade out, he decided, was with an airstrike. Less than 10 minutes later, 3 Corsairs droned overhead. They checked their position and went to work. They flashed down diagonally across the avenue held by Dog Company, almost tipping the blasted treetops, and chopped at the Co-Reds with their 50s. After getting hosed down with 50 caliber slugs, A few of the enemy in front of the barricade made a run for cover. Possibly 2 might have gotten over the top of the street fort. The rest fell under BAR fire.
The city was full of panicky civilians caught in crossfires they were trying to avoid. There were so many in some cases, they became human barricades. While Marines didn't know whom to trust, there were many civilian acts of compassion. Lines became confused. Artillery and mortars pumped 30,000 rounds into Seoul. Riflemen with BARs, pistols, and grenades made up the main line of resistance as they crouched behind M26 tanks. On the forward line, PFC Stanley Christensen and Alfred Walsh spotted the enemy approaching. "There must be 100 of them," Christensen told Walsh. "Get back and warn the outfit. I'll hold them off." Christensen did and died doing it. He too earned the Medal of Honor. PFC Wright realized why buildings should be taken from the top down. "We made one mistake. We started from the bottom and worked up. The North Koreans on the upper floor were trapped. If you've ever saw a man in a fight, it's when he's trapped. We had one hell of a fight on our hands." Wright fought at what later became known as Blood and Bones Corner. It was an intersection situated in such a way that only one rifleman could fire from the corner. At first, it didn't seem different. It was when a team tried to cross that all hell broke loose. As soon as one rifleman went down, another Marine moved up and took his place. That's the way it continued. Wright and another Marine climbed to a second-story window. He nailed him on one block, I nailed him on another. It was a small enough victory for the price, Wright continued. The fire team who tried to cross Blood and Bones Corner was wiped out except for the squad leader. Afterward, he was depressed and guilt-ridden. No one could convince him that it wasn't his fault, which it wasn't. The fight continued, house to house, door to door, until October. The 1st Marine Division suffered 1,064 casualties in Seoul. Murray's 5th Marines lost 177 men. 92 were killed in Puller's 1st Regiment, and Litzenberg's 7th Marines saw 72 die. The division had suffered 2,430 casualties since Inchon. They inflicted 13,666 casualties on the North Koreans and captured 6,490.
The helicopter fluttered down to Kimpo with 2 badly wounded Marines. One of them breathed with difficulty after receiving a machine gun bullet through the chest, and the other was suffering from the shock of mortar fragments in the abdomen. Only an hour and a half before, both men had been engaged in the savage fight of the 5th Marines for the northwest approaches to Seoul. They were evacuated from the firing line in an M26 tank after being taken through the escape hatch. Corpsmen administered first aid and blood plasma at the battalion station, then prepared the men for further evacuation in a flying ambulance holding 2 litters. At the clearing station, the Marine pilot looked on with concern as the patients were removed from the helicopter to be taken to the emergency operating room. The faces of both were gray and haggard, as seen through the plexiglass hoods of the litters. Their hope of survival seemed slim, and the pilot may have been astonished to learn that the mathematical chances were 199 to 1 in favor of each patient coming out alive. This estimate is based upon statistics of the 1st Medical Battalion during the Inchon Seoul operation of the 1st Marine Division from 15 September to 7 October 1950. During these 3 weeks, companies A, B, and C processed a total of 2,484 surgical patients. Of that number, only 9 died after reaching the station, and among them were 6 deaths following major surgery. The proportion of patients surviving after evacuation, therefore, reached a figure of 99.43%. At this point, it would be an oversight not to mention the 28 Navy chaplains, both regular and reserve officers, attached to the major units of the 1st Marine Division at Inchon. Representing the Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish faiths, the chaplain section has a primary mission to minister to the spiritual needs of the troops, bringing men to God and God to men. A secondary mission is to minister to the sick, the wounded, and the dying, and some of the most daring rescues of wounded men on the firing line have been credited to chaplains. More than one Marine's life has been saved because the Padre risked his own to give first aid, and it is the duty of those officers to conduct burial services and write letters of consolation to the next of kin of deceased personnel.
Puller's First Marines signaled the beginning of the end at Seoul when they raised the Stars and Stripes over the American embassy. It caused an Army staff officer to growl, "Ever since that flag-raising picture on Iwo Jima, I'm convinced a Marine would rather carry a flag into battle than a weapon." Puller, a member of the division that had turned Korea from a disastrous rout into a stunning victory for MacArthur, replied, "Not a bad idea. A man with a flag in his pack and the desire to put it on an enemy strong point isn't likely to bug out."
The Presidential Unit Citation is awarded to the 1st Marine Division, reinforced, for services in Korea for extraordinary heroism and action against enemy forces in Korea during the period 15 September to 11 October 1950. In the face of a determined enemy and against almost insurmountable obstacles presented by disadvantageous tidal and beach conditions on the western coast of Korea, the 1st Marine Division, reinforced, pressed to a rapid and completely successful conclusion the amphibious seizure of Inchon, Korea, in an operation unparalleled in the history of amphibious warfare. The precarious situation of friendly ground units already committed against a numerically superior enemy in southern Korea made mandatory the planning and execution of this extremely hazardous amphibious operation within a period of less than 30 days. With full recognition of the vital need for rapid and effective aid to friendly forces being subjected to continued heavy pressure by a relentless enemy, and realizing the military importance of its assigned target, the division moved rapidly into action with incomparable vigor and professional skill. By executing 3 separate but superbly coordinated amphibious attacks over highly treacherous beach approaches against a prepared enemy on 15 September 1950, the division recaptured the island of Wolmi-do, the city of Inchon, Kimpo Airfield, and made possible and assisted in the recapture of the Republic of Korea capital city of Seoul from enemy hands. The division's aggressive attack drove the enemy in hasty retreat over 30 miles within 10 days, completely severed vital enemy lines of communication and supply, greatly relieved enemy pressure on other friendly ground units, made possible the breakout of friendly units from their Pusan beachhead, and resulted in a complete destruction of enemy ground forces in southern Korea. The havoc and destruction wrought by the division on an enemy flushed with previous victories is irrefutable evidence of the individual heroism and professional skill of its officers and men. Consummate planning and unquestioned will to attack against superior odds were vividly demonstrated by the 1st Marine Division in the seizure of Inchon and Seoul. The division's vast accomplishments in completely turning the tide of battle in what of necessity had been previously a defensive action by friendly forces is in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service.